So good afternoon, everybody. We'll just give it another minute or two for other participants to join, but it's a pleasure to have you all participate in the event today. Okay, so let's start. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're based. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about such an important issue. My name is Tiago. I'm a partner at re.capital, one of Brazil's leading firms in sustainable investing. Today, I'll be guiding a conversation on climate change, but that's not going to be a conventional one. Despite the wealth of scientific evidence, we continue to struggle with collective action. But why is that? We're going to begin by exploring the geopolitical lens, particularly the shift in discourse from energy transition to energy security. They're going to move into a sociological perspective to better understand why progress has been so limited. And finally, I'm going to examine how all of this translates into the world of investing, specifically why capital allocation is still falling short of the urgency we face. So to help navigate this discussion, I'm honored to be joined by two esteemed experts. So sorry for the short bios, given that you have done so much in your respective fields. But Dr. Kari Norgaard is a professor of sociology at the University of Oregon and a leading environmental sociologist recognized internationally for her work on climate denial, environmental justice, and indigenous environmental policy. She's the author of influential books and numerous publications, and her research has been widely recognized through awards, media coverage, and her long-standing collaboration with the Karuk tribe on climate adaptation. So welcome, Dr. Kari. And Dr. Eduardo Viola is an Argentinian, almost said Brazilian, I wish, political scientist and professor emeritus at the University of Brasilia, renowned for his work on international climate politics, global governance, and the political economy of sustainability. He has authored numerous publications on Brazil's role in climate negotiation and is a respected voice in Latin America on the intersection of climate change and geopolitical dynamics. Thank you so much for both of you for participating in the event. I will now pass it on to Professor Eduardo Viola to start off.
Okay, thank you very much, Tiago. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this webinar. Next, please. Okay, those are the key messages that I would like to convey today. Some of them will be more compact, other more developed. So, first of all, there are three levels of global power. Okay, economic, military, and non-state actors. The major global power the poles of power are the US, China, the European Union, the UK, we consider together with the European Union, and Russia. The non-state climate actors, global corporations, large companies, national, major NGOs, and the scientific community. Climate geopolitics is driven by economic and military power and falls on economic and non-state levels. Top emitters, China, US, India, European Union, and Russia. Leadership, European Union, UK has been the only consistent leader in the climate regime. Implementation gap, persistent gap between the COP's commitments and national action implementation. Brazil's role in the climate regime lacks structural capacity to lead on climate. This is something that is important to remark, because there is generally the idea that Brazil is a leader or could be a leader and so on. I will develop this more later. There is now growing climate nationalism. What is climate nationalism? A growing trend of prioritization of adaptation over mitigation. This is in the behavior of states, of players, not necessarily in the discourse, okay? And last, the expectations about COP30 remain limited. Next, please. Okay, the three global geopolitical boards, okay? The military, the US is a superpower, China is catching up, Russia remains a nuclear superpower. This is because it is nuclear because it is a superpower, not in other dimensions. The economic board, US is dominant, but China and the European Union are close followers. The non-state board, transnational corporations, high-tech firms. I will remark here the importance of AI and quantum computing corporations, or oriented to global media, major NGOs, and the scientific community. Non-state actors are somewhat independent, but closely tied to their home countries. Cultural power that is relevant, also soft power, is significant at this level. Next one. Okay, the core geopolitical powers into 2025. Quattro main political poles that are very different. The US. The US is a dysfunctional democracy, risking becoming an autocracy within this second Trump administration. Deep societal divide, societal fracture. 26% of world GDP, similar to 30, 40 years ago. It hasn't changed, hasn't changed. 6.5% of fiscal deficit. This is a major problem of the US today. 95% of public debt in relation to GDP. It is a military, energy, and tech superpower. Dollar hegemony weakening, but not alternative to the dollar. China, increasingly centralized autocracy under Xi. 18% of global GDP. Nearing military parity with the US, superpower in economy and tech, but facing a demographic crisis. The European Union. Threat is a democracy, is the core democracy of the world today, okay? Threatened by far-right rise, 20% of world GDP, limited military power, and eroded normative power now, because was the main dimension of the power of the European Union was always particularly the normative power. China and Russia, nuclear and energy superpower, only 2% of global GDP, very different from the other three, okay? Global dynamics hinge on the tension between conflict and cooperation among major powers. Next, please. Okay, here we enter specifically in climate geopolitics, that is the emissions of countries, trajectory of emissions. Climate geopolitics is driven by economic and military geopolitics. In the post-Cold War period, 1990-2016, there was significant cooperation. In the second Cold War period, 2017-2025, rising conflict has reduced cooperation in all dimensions of the system, I would say. Emission shares. China 20, those are data from 23 or 22, it varies, but anyway, no problem. China, and for Climate Watch, the source. China is 26.5% with 9 tons per capita. The US 11.5% with 14 tons per capita. India is 8% with just 3 tons per capita. European Union 7% with just 6.5 tons per capita. Russia 4.5% with 16 tons per capita. Brazil 3.8% with 10 tons per capita. Brazilian per capita varies a lot because varies a lot the emissions coming from deforestation, for example, from 22 to 23 and so on. Indonesia 3.1%, 8 tons per capita. Japan 2.1% of share of global emission, 13 tons per capita. Next. Next, this one is for you to see at another moment. Okay. No, it's okay. Next one. Okay. China. It was 55% of total emission growth between 2000 and 2019. So this is a major impact in the atmosphere in 20 years. The Chinese impact is something without equivalent in world history. It was during this period, and from the point of view, a climate predatory player, okay, but has changed in recent years. Emerged as an ambivalent power. Emissions continue to rise, though at a slower pace, with a commitment to peak by 2030, maybe before, because of the present trajectory, while becoming, in the last years, a global leader in renewable energy, nuclear power, and electric vehicles. Current stance, despite being a superpower across all dimensions, continues to controversially classify itself as a developing country, avoiding obligation to finance poorer nations. This is one very important uncertainty about the Belém COP in November. Next. United States, erratic and conservative trajectory under both Democrats and Republicans, but of course, more negative with Republican administration. Biden, 2021-25, adopted the first US climate policy. The European Union has climate policy since the early 2000s, okay? Even late 1990s. First climate policy of the United States is only in the Biden administration. And it's based solely on incentives and no imposing cost to business. So there is no carbon price in United States. First Trump administration pursued anti-climate policies both domestically and internationally. Second Trump administration is deepening this approach by providing major incentives for fossil fuels production, consumption, and exports, while dismantling federal environmental regulatory frameworks. Next, the European Union, 92 to 22, climate is the leader of the climate regime. Since 2007, constant emission decline. From the point of view today, but this is eroding recently, a strong normative power and operates a regulated carbon market. The only one consistent in relevant carbon market in the world is the European Union, and the price of the ton of carbon is between $80 and $100 the ton. What are the conditions for leadership in the climate regime? That are four. This is a concept, my conceptualization. But first, large share of the global economy the European Union has. significant share of global emissions. The European Union has high technological capacity for decarbonization. The European Union has societal and government support. The European Union has. Okay, the European Union has been the only true leader in the international climate regime. But recently, following the Russia invasion in Ukraine, the European Union shifted focus to security over energy transition, leaving a leadership vacuum or gap in global climate action. Important to say that first, among the conditions of global leadership, for example, China has the first one, has the second one, has the third one, but the fourth one is partial. Was non-existent until 7 years ago, and it's growing right now. And the US has the first, the second, the third, but doesn't have at all the fourth. Next. Brazil. What is the role of Brazil in the carbon market? It's defined by the Amazon vast carbon sink. Consequently, it's a key player in land use change and agriculture, but marginal player, global player in energy, transport, and industry. Emissions profile. Land use change, agriculture, and livestock accounted for between 50 and 75% of total emissions in the period 1990-2024. Oscillation, significant oscillation. In 2023, Brazil contributed 3.2% of global emission with 9 tons per capita. 910 is complex the year and the measure. 2024 forest loss. This is something very relevant, very recent news from the World Resources Institute. Brazil lost 28,000 square kilometers of tropical forest, the highest globally, matching 2004 levels and likely doubling biomass emissions carbon in 24. But half, at least, are attributed to wildfires from global warming, not intentional deforestation. Okay, this is very important because in 2004 it was all intentional deforestation. Okay, so the situation is much more difficult from the point of view of the warming of the earth, and this is increased the forest fires all over the world. This is the example of Brazil, but this is all over the world. And this exposes the limits of the capacity of the state to control deforestation coming from wildfires. Okay? Positioning the climate trajectory in the climate regime: negative until 2004, positive between 2005 and 2015, regressive 2016-2018, very negative 2019-2022, and positive again from 2022 onward. Next one. Next, please. Okay, so here Brazil is not a leader because it lacks the 4 conditions. It's not a large global, doesn't have a large proportion of global GDP, doesn't have a significant share of global carbon emissions, strong, I will say, doesn't have a strong decarbonization capacity, and doesn't have unified societal and government support. But Brazil could be lead on deforestation control and low carbon agriculture. But this requires broader societal and political alignment that doesn't exist right now. The third rule administration is characterized by the major policy contradiction. From one side, strongly committed to control deforestation, not only in the Amazon, but in other biomes also, in other ecosystems. But it's also strongly committed with expanding oil production and exports. Climate finance paradox. Under the climate justice principle, Brazil shouldn't receive international finance, but it does. Like the most important is the Amazon Fund. Why? Because due to its forest stewardship and a stronger institutional capacity than other tropical nations. So this is the explanation for why Brazil is receiving a significant part of climate finance, not qualifying from the point of view of climate justice. Next one. Recent evolution of international climate policy. Climate regime emerged in a post-Cold War led by the Western democracy. Emission grew 2% a year unevenly after 2005, slower in the 2020s. Recent acceleration of global warming and extreme weather. The regime has had mixed success because raised awareness and promoted renewables. Paris Agreement and World Economic Forum crucial in pushing decarbonization in Western corporations. Most countries' targets are incompatible with 1.5 goal. Global average temperature already hit 1.5 in 23-24, is over 19,000. Okay, on current path, Earth will warm 2.4 to 2.8 by 2100. Next one. Persistent gap between negotiated declaration and actual implementation. This is key, has been key in the whole history of the climate regime. In 24, wind and solar are cost competitive in many regions, but fossil fuel interests resist. Intermittency issue and battery breakthrough are under debate. There are some analysts very optimistic, but others not so much in relation to this. Energy transition is deep and irreversible. Deep and irreversible, but too slow to avoid 2 degrees warming. 1.5 is already unachievable. Okay, growing climate nationalism, adaptation priority over mitigation. High-income countries show limited commitment to climate finance, very limited. Low and lower middle-income countries face a dear challenge. Next one. Expectation for COP30. Limited expectation due to geopolitical rivalries, crisis of multilateralism, US disengagement, scarce climate finance, and uncertainty about the role of China. How much China will be available to consider itself a developed country with obligation to funding poor countries. This is uncertain. Could happen? No. Brazil approach. What is the approach of Brazil right now? Focused on process continuity and broad declaration, but maybe struggled with financial demands from poorer nations. That will happen again for sure, like in previous COPs. The COP30 in Belém expected to see a strong global civil society engagement, as in Glasgow 21, following 3 COPs in autocracies. Okay. Government stance, actively promoting inclusion of Amazonian and civil society both. Okay. A bold move given Brazil's oil-related vulnerabilities. Impact outlook. Likely to draw global media and public attention, but long-term outcomes remain uncertain. Okay, this is the end. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a profoundly useful orientation and just overview, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to switch gears, but all of the framework that you've just laid out, especially in terms of thinking about these three levels of power geophysically and then the detail of the context in different countries, I think will be really useful for what I'm going to do, which will be a deeper dive into a particular context. My work is set in Norway, but it is also sort of a view from an individual country level. And I will be, as a sociologist that thinks about emotions, I'm also speaking to things at the individual level that hopefully will be useful and fit well. And then Tiago, we're relying on you to integrate it all. So thank you. So my work will be looking at climate denial and inertia. Next slide, please. And so this is responding to a paradox that we're all familiar with at this point, which is the gap between our awareness of what's happening and the response. And this is Dr. James Hansen testifying in 1988 before Congress about the seriousness of climate change and the path that we're on. And of course, through all of the different mechanisms that have since developed from the scientific community, and the United Nations, there has been increasing urgency and awareness since. Next slide, please. And yet from a public perspective, and of course, the public being one of the three sort of boards that you kindly laid out, there's been very little background, very little response and engagement. But we can really look at this because, of course, there has been more social movement mobilization. We can also look at this gap between our knowledge of the situation at multiple levels in addition to sort of the public sphere. And I think that specifically in this context, we'll be looking at it in terms of investment world and finance. We can also think about it at every governmental level. Next slide, please. So there's been, again, this is Dr. Michael Mann, who's been an outspoken climate scientist, one of the individuals who really laid out the larger background through his hockey stick graph, the longer time frame, and very strong evidence that climate change is in fact happening. And what I want to paint is this picture of how social inertia is occurring. And again, thinking about this as a sociologist, the different levels of power that I'll evoke have to do with the individual, the cultural, and the larger institutional economic, which is more in the terrain that has been so beautifully laid out just now. Thank you. Next slide. So again, thinking about these individual and psychological, the role of cultural and social factors, things like narratives, the ways that we tell stories, the ways that we conceive of space and time. Excuse me. And I want to close then with some strategies, which again, Tiago will, I think, wrap up. Yeah, next slide is good. So the entry point for my work, excuse me, the entry point for my work has been an assumption, which I think has changed somewhat since I first began working on this nearly 20 years ago, but still does hold in our minds, which is the idea that we're not responding because either we don't have information, we don't actually know how serious the crisis is, or that there is an individualism and greed, that people actually don't care. And I think that there's been a shift in the extent to which that's the go-to reaction that we have when we look at this, a shift to a more sophisticated understanding of the political constraints. But I want to encourage you to consider the extent to which, as you confront this dilemma in the context that each of you find yourselves in, that you may fall back on either the idea that people don't know or that people don't care. And I want to make sure to make clear, information is essential. Information is essential, but often when we has to be the right kind of information people can shut down from too much information. And of course, caring is essential as well. And very much people absolutely shut down when it seems too difficult, too overwhelming. And that's the idea of psychological denial that we're familiar with. And I'm going to expand that framework. Next slide, please. So I want to draw for a minute on the work of Dr. Stanley Cohen, who is no longer with us. He's a British sociologist who worked on denial and pieced out that there are different scales and kinds of denial. And the kind that we're most familiar with is the idea of literal denial, and again, at a psychological level. But in fact, there are two other kinds of denial that are especially important for climate change. One is the framework of interpretive denial, which comes into place often in terms of shifting blame or minimizing context, minimizing the extent of responsibility. And then the third, which is actually very familiar to all of us, but often, least often sort of made explicit, and that's the idea of implicatory denial. Next slide, please. And in implicatory denial, we are essentially not following up on the consequences of something that we understand and acknowledge to be true. And Cohen, working over a decade ago, uses some examples that are no longer as relevant now, and some of them are equally relevant, but that these particular events are recognized, but they are essentially not seen or not seen as responding, as disturbing or as carrying a moral imperative to respond. And it's this, again, sort of this moral imperative that we are pointing to, that knowledge is not at stake, but doing the right thing with the knowledge. Next slide. And so it's this failure to translate knowledge into an action in our lives. And so what I did work initially in Norway, where I did the most ethnographic work, but also follow up in the United States. And I want to just briefly, so this is a particular context that's different from the context I think that anyone listening will find themselves in, but I want to encourage you to translate how what I'm describing in this context may apply in a context in which you find yourselves. So this particular community is a smaller community of about 5,000 people. It's a farm town in this place, which is fairly far north. Being in Norway, the snow was quite late. And this is a place where people have a strong cultural, economic connection to skiing. And yet the fact that snow came quite profoundly late that year didn't translate into anything in social or political life. It was ignored, essentially. Next slide. And what I did is I was watching what was happening, and then I and watched in different kinds of social contexts, trying to figure out how is it that people ignored this significant local event, and why, and how did they do it? And then after watching for a while, I asked them in interviews, what is going on? And so the people described that it was something that they really didn't think about in the everyday, but when they did, it was discouraging and an emotional weight. And I drew here on the work of a wonderful historical psychologist, Dr. Lifton, who wrote about the concept of the absurdity of the double life. And I want to propose that this is something that all of us live with all the time. He initially developed this framework in relation to the rise of potential of nuclear war in the 1980s, which is something that was formative for me personally. But that we actually now experience this in many areas of life, where what we understand to be true is not congruent with the organization of our daily lives. Next slide. And so this is, I want to say a few words about how social inertia then is created from this individual level experience. And I want to remind you that, you know, for many people, it's at the psychological or individual level that this awareness of this disjuncture sort of stops. but that we really need to think about expanding it to a cultural, collective, social level, because that is a place where there's going to be many opportunities to engage and respond. And otherwise, we kind of fail to understand the context in which any individual behavior is happening. So this is essentially, amongst other things, destabilizing for our individual senses of who we are. Next slide, please. And I want to talk about 3 emotions that people raised and described to me, and which I observed. Now, emotions are often seen as something that's very private, but for a sociologist, I think about emotions in a very political way, in a very socially constructed way, that actually emotions are what link us to the world around us in many ways. And the things that we feel or don't feel are very much a product of our social location and our political economic context. But I want to draw on psychological work here, specifically the idea of cognitive dissonance. So the 3 emotions that I ended up working with that people described to me is why they did not engage more on climate change was a sense of guilt, a sense of fear about the future, and a sense of helplessness. And I want to ask each of you, to just reflect yourselves to the extent that these are relevant for you or not, noting in particular that in a Norwegian context and an American context as well as very high emissions countries, guilt is something that is relevant, but it may not be as relevant in other social and political contexts. And again, thinking about how emotions thus are linked to our political economic context. But what I want to work with first is the idea of cognitive dissonance. And this is the idea from Leon Festinger that we cannot hold 2 conflicting ideas in our minds simultaneously. And so guilt is set in relation, it threatens our sense of individual and national identity. And other psychological theory also describes that we actually have a need to see ourselves as good, a psychological need. And certainly we all want to, at some level, believe that our nation is a good place. This is important for so many things. So this bumps up against a national identity. So you can see I have the emotion on the left, and then this way that it matters, and we can see how these are in conflict in terms of cognitive dissonance. The guilt is in conflict with the sense, the need to see ourselves as in a positive light. Similarly, fear about the future bumps up against another psychological need, which is a need that we have, that there is order in the world. And of course, fear about the future is directly in conflict with the sense that there will be a future, that there's order, that the future is knowable, that it will be good for our children, any of these things. And then the third emotion that I identify, the sense of helplessness, and that this too, that we have a need to see ourselves as self-efficacious, as able to be powerful in the world in some way. And that we also have a need, this is not just, and we also, this is also part of our identity, to be able to perceive ourselves as powerful. So again, thinking about each of these are psychological constraints that come up with these emotions, which people are motivated to avoid. Next slide. I want to next give just a few examples in people's words of each of these emotions, and then I'll move to the next levels. I won't read these out, but in full, but people, describing a sense of fear about the future. Here's people making artificial snow in this community where it's just so dependent on tourism. The very first slide, which is also from the cover of my book, is showing a ski run on 100% artificial snow, which is how they opened the ski area that year. Next slide. Similarly, in terms of guilt, this idea that there is a gap between the way that people live, and this is actually from an American, and the way culturally context that you can be against global warming, climate change, but people are still heating homes and driving cars and shipping food long distances. And it's very hard to live in a social context and be aligned with your beliefs on the environment. And again, you can see the social context when we're thinking about why per capita emissions are so different in different countries. It's much easier to live aligned with your values if you have a social infrastructure which is organized around clean energy, if you have a social infrastructure in which your food is locally produced. And these are not things that individuals have choices about, although of course we have the ability to act. Next slide. Okay, and then the third emotion, this one of helplessness, a very powerful negative emotion that all of us are motivated not to experience. That no matter what they do, they can't do anything about it anyway. Again, thinking about an American context, that sense of a disillusionment with our political system and the sense of agency. Do we in fact have agency in the context of this large, rapidly eroding democracy? Next slide. So thinking now again about the next level of what sociologists talk about social power, of how social inertia is happened through cultural norms, through interactions, through cultural narratives. And whatever I am able to talk about, think about, or even feel in my context is actually a function of what the people around me are talking about, feeling, and sort of, otherwise I'll be written off as crazy. People will fail to understand what I have to say. We can imagine all this is what social norms do. This is social. This is the social fact of any of our context. Next slide, please. And so talking about climate change and the fact of climate change not only is interrupting our individual identity, but also sort of the soundness of our social interactions, which we are social animals, extremely important. This was a wildfire some years ago, and you can see people playing golf, considering just carrying on this, and the social interactions of perhaps shopping for produce at a very aesthetically beautiful farmer's market. Next slide, please. And so in order to fit in order to carry out our daily life, in order to retain the esteem of our peers, we have to do a kind of social work. We have to do a kind of work, and that is, we do this in different ways. And these are from people's own words, the way they described it. So of course, we know we can't dig ourselves into depression. So we have to do things like control exposure to information. People described how they may focus on certain facts, but it's better not to know everything. And as a result of this, you have the knowledge, but you live in another world. We collectively recreate a world in which climate change is kept at a distance through these kinds of social interactions, like how we access news, how we access different kinds of information. Next slide. So people talked about, this is also around norms of time and space. And so we collectively shape how far into the future we think, and how far in distance we think. And again, people describe that specifically because of the guilty conscience, they work to keep information, to not think about things in other places or in other times. Next slide. There's also a variety, and again, I want to encourage you, each of you, to think about the extent to which these forms of social labor or individual labor, collective labor, are relevant for your social context. So in Norway, there's been a strong narrative around being close to nature, telling cultural norms, pointing fingers at other countries. Of course, it's true that the United States, China, other countries are very large contributors, but is this being done as a way of minimizing the agency which does exist in that particular cultural context? Is it done as a way of the literal denial, of changing the discourse so that it would appear that there is no responsibility for that context? The idea of that Norway is a very small country, despite the very large, oversized contribution to oil and natural gas. And then an emphasis of sort of, well, Norway is a little land where people are this image of a child and and again, I'm not to say that any of these don't have truth in them. They wouldn't work if they don't have truth. But how and why are different cultural stories being told in different contexts? Next slide. Similarly, Dr. Lifton came up with this idea of what are called claims to virtue. Norwegian oil is cleaner, gas is better than coal. Next slide. And as a result, and here I'm referencing the work of Dr. Bourdieu and a paper that I did with Dr. Robert Bruhl in 2019, where we used Bourdieu to sort of reference these different different levels of social power. Similarly, the idea of climate change disrupts the level of normalcy at the institutional level in many different social contexts. Next slide. And institutions themselves have their own logic, their own social needs, their own social context. There are transactional costs to trying to change. There's uncertainty in the political climate, which is, which economic decision makers needs to be made within. And there's a lot of inertia in terms of the benefit of an existing set of institutions not to change course. Next slide. These are social realities for institutions, for actors at these levels. So as I move towards just wrapping this up, then if this sense of climate inertia, this inertia for change or denial is happening at these three different levels, and again, thinking about the macro level, very nicely laid out in the first part of our work today. But I gave some examples from the Norwegian context. That is one where individual actors and there's less agency at the individual level, but it nonetheless profoundly shapes where any of us in our various institutional contexts stand. Next slide. Just briefly, actually we can skip this just in the interest of time, but essentially there's also cultural trauma happening. You can slip this in the next one. Yeah, go ahead, thank you. Next slide, thank you. Okay, thanks. So as a result of all of this, it's actually really impossible. I want to talk about the idea of imagination in closing, and thinking about how we might imagine and what we need to imagine, because as a result of what's happening, each of us is actually failing to understand, and at a certain level, we may be acting rationally in terms of our social and political constraints and our social and political context, but we are individually and collectively not acting rationally in terms of our larger world, the survival of our world. And we need to be able to envision how we can do something differently. That is ultimately what is at stake. And I want to hold out that we do have power individually and in our different contexts. Next slide. So imagination is actually a form of power. We are in a crisis. And I want to suggest that there are two kinds of imagination that should be cultivated. Next slide. The first is this imagination, an ecological imagination, which is to understand how our individual actions, how our institutional actions translate into the natural world. And these carbon footprint calculators have been very wonderful, actually, in this. They don't give us a lot of information about how society works, how we can change, or any of those kinds of things, but they do provide a tool that allows us to perceive that there is a link between what we do and a carbon emissions. Next slide. But we also need to be able to see these social relationships inside in our society that how social change happens, the moments and leverage points when we do have power, because we actually are in a situation where the world is changing very, very rapidly. And these opportunities do come up and they do happen, and we haven't fully lost either the social power in the collective public sphere, or we certainly haven't lost the social power in the sphere of finance. Next slide. And so again, I want to really encourage all of you are going to be important in sort of elaborating how many of these play out. but thinking about strategies to shift different mindsets and for proactive engagement. Next slide. And again, essentially, we have very limited imagination at the moment about visualizing our current situation or the future. Next slide. But I want to say that if inertia is happening in these levels, that there are opportunities to interrupt it at multiple levels. Next slide. At the individual level, we can think of ways that we ourselves feel more empowered, feel less helpless, feel less guilty. These may include working in together, such as this organization, working in community at different forms, and building on existing cultural traditions that can encourage our engagement. And I have a recent paper looking at this in the Norwegian context. Next slide. And again, there's cultural norms set up these perceptions. Next slide. The opportunities will vary across different kinds of institutional contexts. Next slide. We have many discourses today that are generally limiting, and I encourage us to consider other alternatives that, again, are more focused on the kinds of things that can be done. Next slide. I want to say again, we need a collective discourse about what we can do. Next slide. I want to suggest that the discourse of rights has been less useful for us, and that we should consider ways that we can foster a discourse of responsibility. Next slide. Next slide. But that we need to be able to visualize how we have collective power. Next slide. And here I want to give a shout out to finance, and this will be this can be my last slide. I guess there's one more I'll close with after this, but that this is the recent work I've been doing on the Klamath Dam removal, and that finance was actually absolutely integral to this happening. And so we just wanted to hold this out as a positive example. This is the largest dam removal that we've had globally. I was just at this site less than a week ago. This dam had stood for over 100 years, and the global finance was really key for that. Next slide. Oops, yeah, next slide. So there are many larger changes that are beyond our control, but that we are actually in a time when things are rapidly changing, and we need to be able to be aware and not feel powerless and hopeless, that there will be continual opportunities that are emergent, but we need to know that it matters for us to tackle them. Okay, that's next slide. That's the last one. Obrigada.
No, that's great. Thank you both so much for setting the stage and providing so much useful information. And now I suggest that we turn into the investment implications. I'm going to be very quick about this because I see we already have a couple of questions, and I definitely wanted to make some time for those. But the question is, at the end of the day, how do these sociological dynamics shape the way investors incorporate climate considerations into their capital allocation? Just like Kari has already explored, individuals are often aware of the climate crisis, but find it difficult to act. I think the same paradox applies to investors. Next slide, please. This is evident in the uneven distribution of climate investments across sectors and geographies. Let's just take clean energy, for example. It took decades of subsidies for clean energy to become viable. And while investments in the sector have reached nearly $2 trillion in 2024 alone, only about 15% of that was directed toward emerging economies. So it gets us to thinking it has to become financially feasible for investors to allocate capital into that, but it gets disproportionately allocated. It is indeed encouraging that renewable energy investments are hitting record highs year after year. But it's, in my view, troubling that fossil fuel investments are also rising in parallel. So it becomes kind of useless to invest in decarbonization across different sectors if we are also investing even heavier into hard-to-abate sectors. What's even more concerning, in my view, is that many oil and gas companies, they continue to underinvest in decarbonization strategies or meaningful energy transition plans. And that's across different geographies as well. So while we can acknowledge the momentum in clean energy, and we're talking about energy in specific, but we can extrapolate this analysis to other sectors as well, we must also recognize that we are still falling short of what is needed, what we need to do, where we need to deploy capital. So according to the Climate Policy Initiative, if we are serious about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which there is a huge debate on whether this is even possible at this point, we need to mobilize over $7.5 trillion annually by 2030, so 5 years from now, and from 2031 to 2040, up to $8.8 trillion annually. And we have to put in perspective what is the highest amount of capital mobilization that we have done on an annual basis, which was in 2022 at $1.46 trillion. So just to illustrate that this gap is real. Next. So we understand that the gap is widening, and I believe that there are some aspects that do explain that. And I want to piggyback on some of the aspects that Professor Kari brought to us. So investors, as everyday people, we tend to be knowledgeable about climate risk, but actions, they usually do not reflect that. So the tendency to look for patterns in the past performance contributes to that, because investors struggle to understand how climate will impact financials in the future. And the industry's strong focus on short-term returns only reinforces the inertia. I'll come back to that in a minute in a separate slide. But second, discussing climate can be uncomfortable, and Dr. Kari went deeply through that. And investors are expected to be cold and make rational decisions. So it's not uncommon for investors to care deeply about the issue in their personal lives, but it's unlikely that they integrate this into investment activities. And we need to consider how this needs to be integrated on day-to-day investment activities. Also, investors who build climate-oriented strategies, they're frequently labeled as either too idealistic or biased. This definitely creates a stigma that discourages innovation and risk-taking in the climate space. Even when the financial rationale is solid, even when we can talk about superior risk-adjusted returns, even when we can illustrate that through a more pragmatic way of deploying capital, of making the investments, that's usually the case. And in my experience, regardless of the geography, we see that in Brazil, we see that in Europe, we see that in the US. And lastly, inaction has been institutionalized. Since most investors do not incorporate climate into their investment strategies, those who do are seen as niche investors, or even worse than that, right? They are perceived as investors willing to sacrifice returns for impact. And this perception is not only wrong, it's also harmful to progress, because you reinforce that stigma that I talked about a minute earlier. Next one, please. So this chart illustrates what I said earlier about investors' short sight. So typically investors will focus on short investment horizons, especially in emerging markets, which are often perceived to be more volatile, when often that's not the case. But when valuing an asset, we as investors, we tend to think of future cash flows, and we hardly ever project beyond 5 or 8 years. But when we talk about climate-related impacts, we need to look at longer time horizons of about 30 plus years. Climate events, they're increasingly more frequent and intense, and investors really should be thinking about the impact in the perpetuity of their cash flows. And that is across all sectors, across all geographies. Don't want to get into the technicalities of evaluation exercise, but when investors look at this, a big component of value is at the perpetuity. If we can't see how climate is going to impact that, obviously that's going to pose a tremendous impact on the actual valuation of any assets. And I mean, here we even talking about fiduciary duty with investors to be really disciplined on how relevant risks, including climate risks, need to be considered. Next one, please. But what should we do? Or better yet, how should we reframe the path forward? This is not an exhaustive list, but I would highlight 4 points to keep the discussion going. So first of all, climate strategies should be incorporated across all investments. The rationale here is that if this really is important to increase risk-adjusted returns, why would investors consider climate elements in some investments but not in others? Oftentimes, we come across asset managers that have one dedicated climate fund, but they do not include climate considerations across all of the investment analysis. But if they're claiming that by doing that, they are positioning that specific fund to create superior risk-adjusted returns, maybe they're failing in delivering the fiduciary duty in the rest of the products. So this is really something that we have to consider. Here at Fama, these are the core of our investment strategy, but we can think of other larger global firms that incorporate this in strategy, such as Generation Investment Management and others as well. Secondly, we need to think about building internal capacity in general. As we said multiple times during this discussion, although many people are generally knowledgeable about climate change, few investors specifically, do understand the impact of physical and transition risks in the operations and how they impact the financials. So this is a call up to asset owners that because they play a key role in demanding this integration from asset managers, and we really need to understand what this risk encompasses, because otherwise we're not going to be able to understand how that impact operations of companies and in last instance the financials. Talking about asset owners, how can they articulate asset managers' responsibility to engage with the companies they invest in, aiming at decarbonization? I think my assumption here is that investing in and engaging with brown companies, the highest emitters, to decarbonize is more likely to create marginal impact than when we invest in green companies. And I think people don't usually know about that, but this has been widely corroborated by literature. And I think we have various examples of literature that brings that to light. And lastly, we should definitely rethink incentives and mandates. And this is a very sensitive topic for investors. I have personally followed through some of these discussions. And compensation structures like the Kari for private equity investors or performance fee for listed equity investors, they should be linked to climate-related outcomes. And fiduciary duty should be redesigned to include systemic resilience and intergenerational risk. Again, something for asset owners to pay attention to. And I think they are to some extent, right? Next one. So just to conclude, in a nutshell, climate-related discussions can be uncomfortable, as we've seen today. I mean, many different behavior aspects that corroborate with that and that justify that, especially when we confront the reality that collectively we're still falling short of personally addressing the issue of deploying capital and so on and so forth. But it's essential that we shine a light on why that is, and that's what we attempted to do today. So as humans, we have an extraordinary ability to mobilize when the stakes are clear and the incentives are aligned. The challenge now is to create those incentives and to act with the urgency that this moment demands. This is what we had for you today. Appreciate everybody's participation. Hope it has been useful for all of you. I don't know if for those who are still with us, if you have a few minutes, a couple of questions, we can take a couple of questions here. Yeah, Mark, maybe, yeah, there you go. What is yours?
Hi, Dr. Kari, Tiago, Eduardo. Thank you for having Amanda. Thank you for having this wonderful seminar. I believe everything that you guys said is for the people who believe in climate change. And what we are missing is engaging the other side. And for the marketing, it needs to focus on pollution and poisoning of the environment in urban areas, in rural, the way we produce our food and things like this. And then on the financial side, if we push to change the generally accepted accounting principles to include benefiting circular practices instead of what exists today, then we will be able to see real change. What do you guys think of that?
I'm happy to respond, but Eduardo, do you care to? I think you're muted.
Mute.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you are right. I mean, pollution is air pollution, water pollution is something extremely tangible, extremely people perceive. But there is something new in climate. That is that the climate extreme, global warming was something extremely abstract until 10 years ago. But the dramatic increase in frequency and intensity of climate extremes takes global warming to the everyday life experience of people. Okay, and so from extreme heat, extreme flooding, extreme rainfall, extreme draw. Okay, so I think now the issue of climate change today is much more communicable compared with 10 years ago.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I would agree, and I think it's a good question as well. And I think that there has been so much focus, however, on the issue of people who are most overtly not believing or all of the misinformation at that level. And I think it's therefore extremely important, in different parts of the world it varies, but in most countries, actually more people do believe that climate change is happening than don't. And so I think it's really important to understand the context in that situation. I think it's another threat essentially to our democracy that we have, or to our ability to respond, that is far less attention than the kind of literal denial which you described, which is also extremely important. And I would agree with Eduardo that there's an element to this because of the way that the immediacy of these climate impacts are affecting people's lives. And I certainly agree that is increased. Certainly, for in my part of the world, wildfire is an immediate threat. But also, these rapid extreme events where we have really rapid flooding and changes in temperature. And it makes sense to build on these places, as you noted with pollution, Mark. I think I absolutely agree with you as well that there are elements where there is common cause, and these are the places to build momentum. Absolutely, I would agree with that. And many of the things many language around climate change, we don't need to use that language per se in a case where it's not going to have as much traction. But in other cases, I think we do need to have that conversation on the table for the many people who do see that framework, and the fact that is a framework that is occurring. But thank you, beautiful question.
Okay, so I'll take another question from the chat from Priscilla to Dr. Kari. So she asks, on the opposition to guilt, would it be to feel proud about a nation's action towards climate change actions?
I'm sorry, would you, maybe I could see the question in the chat if I look at it, or would you mind repeating it real quick?
Sure. Dr. Kari, on the opposition to guilt, would it be to feel proud about a nation's action toward climate change actions?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great thing. So yeah, different antidotes to these kinds of things. So one, yes, to be proud of a nation's climate activism, to help people understand the context. For example, for any of us in the United States, we are constrained by the fact that we don't have public transit systems, by our nation's military action, which I, as an individual, do not have a lot of power over. And so for me to feel individually guilty about that isn't particularly, it's kind of a misunderstanding of a lack of understanding of how power is working in this context. So helping people to understand that can shape a sense of guilt, but also I have a paper recently with Anna Kristina Hagestad in Norway that's looking at building on existing cultural traditions um, to magnify, I can magnify a sense of positivity in terms of Norwegian national identity, but also work against a sense of helplessness. So we're talking about a cultural tradition of working together called dugnad in Norway, which could be expanded to a sense of working together on the climate. So building on existing frameworks that people can identify with, cultural frameworks, cultural tools can be a way to do this. And Tiago, I really found your closing, wrapping up of in terms of the investment particulars to be useful. And I think thinking about tools or strategies within the particular community of people that you're working with, that you're trying to mobilize to actually see the impacts that are there and occurring and will occur that we're not currently seeing.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. I'll just take one from the Q&A section from Marina Targa. Thank you for the enlightening discussion from all speakers. I'd like to hear your thoughts on Petrobras moving forward with the potential exploration of the falls of the Amazonas Basin. While some argue this could bring significant economic and financial benefits to Brazil, do you believe investing in oil is still a good asset in the current global context? Maybe I'll just take this one myself. Just to clarify, Dr. Kari, Petrobras is the largest Brazilian company, oil and gas, globally known for that. And I think I can maybe provide like an investor perspective. And I think when we look at the materialization of transition risks, which includes regulatory changes, demand changes in the demand side, litigation events happening increasingly more frequently, we tend to believe that such assets will like become stranded. If you asked me this question 5 years ago, I'll probably have an answer. Post-war in Ukraine, I think I would have another answer, exactly for the reasons that Professor Viola described earlier. Because when we think about like creating this rhetoric of energy transition, post-war, which is the time we're living now, we are more concerned about energy security. And I think that tends to prolong a little bit when we think these assets are going to be, will become stranded. So from like a conventional investment perspective, maybe it will be so far off in the future that it still qualifies as a good investment. I personally do not only believe that it is not a good investment, but also I think that because the intensity and frequency of climate events will increase, we tend to see the movement of these assets becoming stranded faster than we can anticipate now. It's a discussion about like not knowing how to articulate what we don't know. And I think whether this is going to be something in 5 to 10 years, I don't know, but definitely it's not going to be something in 100 years. It's going to be closer to that. So in a nutshell, I don't think it is a good investment, economically, financially speaking, but also in terms of like fiduciary duty with the investors. I don't know, Professor Viola, if you'd like to add.
Just complementing, I agree with you, Tiago. But let's consider analytically the social forces in Brazil. So from this point of view, my guess is that a large majority of the Brazilian, unfortunately, of the Brazilian society are in favor of exploring oil in the equatorial margin. This is the reality. The forces in favor of decarbonization in this issue, in terms of percentage of the population, is not more than 20% of the population, okay? Though the forces, the established forces, and here there is something that is also very relevant. It's the idea that every country is increasing investment in oil. And this is true. It was not true. There was a pause in oil investment in the Western world between 2018 and 2022. But in 22 increased again the investment of oil all over the world. So the question is that the stranded asset will come, and not only just for Brazil, will come probably for everybody sooner rather than later. But the question is that I don't think it's a battle that decarbonization forces could win in the present conjuncture in Brazil. Okay, so from this point of view, the most important thing is to let's say to promote that the exploration and production of the equatorial margin being really for energy transition. Okay, so the profits of those investments being really and to control this accountability from society. It is a mixed corporation, public, so a strong accountability for the profitability of the exploration be to energy transition. Because so far, according to the present inertia of interest, this is not guaranteed at all. Okay, so it will be an exploration without without using for energy transition.
Okay, we have run out of time. As a matter of fact, I see we still have a few questions left. Unfortunately, we're not gonna have time to address those. Feel free to reach out to us. I just wanted to note that we're gonna share the recording to participants as well as the presentation per se. So I hope you have enjoyed the session, and should you have any doubts, questions, or would like to continue the conversations, we are open to that. Thank you so much, Dr. Kari, and thank you so much, Dr. Eduardo Viola, for participating in this enlightening conversation. I hope this unfolds into multiple other opportunities for us to discuss this topic, which is so relevant. Thank you to the audience, and you all have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to participate. Good luck with our work and our world.
Yeah, we're together.